Hello, I just want to make a video on trauma, this word that's used and abused all over the place. Okay, now when people use the word trauma, it's often they're talking about painful or very difficult events, um, triggering events, or anything like that, which in themselves, from a clinical perspective, are not traumatic at all. It's trauma. Let me explain what trauma really is. Well, let's take pain, okay? So here's our painometer. It starts off here, you're in the comfortable zone. The pain increases, comes up to the orange zone, distinctly uncomfortable, quite painful, hits the red zone, getting into really, really painful, even excruciating. And then the pain gets so great that we go from red to blackout zone. That is where the trauma is. It's in the blackout zone. A trauma is a pain so great, or so relentless that our body shuts the pain down altogether. With true trauma, you go from feeling so much to feeling nothing at all, or largely nothing at all. As I say, the blackout zone. And that's where all the real fireworks, the real problems, the long-lasting impact of trauma really happens. Because by definition of repression, that blacking out is repression, you end up with unprocessed pain, which affects the system behind the scenes. Now, the best way to explain trauma is to explain it as the natural neurological system that it is and is meant to be. Basically, trauma is the brain's answer to this question: how can pain do its job to drive a defensive response when it is simply too much to be felt, when it can't be felt directly? The answer is, once it gets repressed, the trauma gets repressed and blacked out, it still does its job by generating a compulsive response. So it drives us not with ouch, but with urge. Okay, now the best way that I can explain it, of course, is to give you an example. This is my favorite example that I've had for many years. It's called the walking man story. Once upon a time, there was a walking man. The walking man came up to a bridge and he started walking across the bridge. Halfway across the bridge, he looked down and, my God, it's only 1 foot wide. And it's a slippery bridge too. He realized I could easily fall to my death at any time. The terror was too much for him and threatened to overwhelm him, so he couldn't cope and deal with the situation and survive. So what did he do? His brain repressed the fear. He had to repress the fear because the signal was too much and he needed to focus all his attention on survival in the moment, just to get across that bridge as best as he can without being so terrified that he goes into a panic and falls off anyway. Okay, that's the way to look at it. So he just channeled, blocked the fear, and compulsively, the fear signal then turned into compulsion, focused, and just got to the end of the bridge. He survived. He did get to the end of the bridge. But when he got to the end of the bridge, we noticed something. When he got there, we noticed something very interesting. And that is, he was still preoccupied and walking in a kind of a straight as possible line and still in a state of fear, unconscious fear. He didn't so much feel the fear directly. There was just like a constant amorphous sort of a worry in his mind. So what he did is he started head tripping when he was on open, flat, safe ground, and he was thinking, starts head tripping to himself, going, "Man, an earthquake could happen any time and open up the earth underneath me, the ground underneath me, and I could fall in." So he was constantly preoccupied with the possibility of earthquakes and constantly in a state where he was ready to respond, ready to run to either the left or the right if the ground broke up in front of him. Okay, crazy? Well, you could call it crazy, but basically what it is the neurotic system, the compulsive trauma-based system still clicking over in the open land context. I mean, as it's being commonly said, and accurately so, that when we're traumatized, we act out in the present as though we're still in the past. That's because the internalized pain is still there and driving the system in a compulsive way. And we're effectively psychologically recreating the past in the present. That's what trauma does. Another good example to explain it, a very classic example, is take a child who almost drowned and was severely traumatized by it. okay, a severe traumatic and near-death drowning. As an adult, they might come up to a bath of water. Okay, time to take your bath, and a nice deep bath of water. When they look at that water, they go like this: I can't get in. Why not? I don't know why. I know it's crazy. I know it's stupid. But whenever I look at that thing of water, that bath of water, I just start freaking out because of their traumatic past. That is the triggering of pain, the triggering of the early trauma. So basically, it's ridiculous, but the feeling brain, the lower brainstem, like the brainstem and the limbic system, and the midbrain, is functionally split from the neocortex, the thinking brain. So the thinking brain knows that it's crazy, but the lower brain stems, the feeling brain stem system, can't help triggering the signal. It's almost like a bad manager at work. A bad manager at work, if there's a problem with something going on, they'll just create this huge sweeping regulation to eliminate the problem and never mind the collateral damage it has, rather than looking at the problem and understanding it more comprehensively and making sure basically and solving the problem in a less disruptive or less dramatic way. It's draconian. Like trauma imprints work as draconian signals to barbarically make sure the original infliction never happens again. Like bad management in a sense. Now that is what trauma is, and that is how it works. It's basically a very, very crude, barbaric system that makes sure the original infliction never happens again. It puts the system onto autopilot and makes us sort of stuck in our past, acting out in the present as though we're still in the past. With those two examples. That is what real trauma is. Okay. And it's everywhere. In all of us, we've all had major traumas in infancy, especially with problematic birthing practices like major birthing complications. That's where the most powerful traumas are. And the emotional traumas of to cut a long story short, not growing up with parents who can love their children in a proper way because due to their own traumatic business inside their own minds, which forces them into their own world. It cuts them off, forces them into their own world where they're basically 90% taking care of themselves, so there's not much left over to take care of their children. Okay, Dr. Arthur Janoff has written brilliant books on this, but that's a huge elaboration and I won't go there. Okay, now I'm going to turn the page with this and make a very interesting insight. Well, I think it's interesting on where I think certain types of communist and totalitarian regimes come from or may come from. Historically, in wartime, war heroes became super popular. They often became generals and leaders. One problem with that: a guy who has seen frontline battle and watched people's heads explode right beside them and every other unbelievably unimaginable hideous sight has been horrifically traumatized. There is no doubt about it. The human brain cannot withstand that kind of psychological stress without going through the repression process. So just like the walking man, my walking man story, who's stuck on the bridge, the guy who's went to war is effectively stuck in their war as well. They don't feel the terror of it. They've internalized it, but they're in a war mode. And because they're in their war mode, they naturally think, and I think Adolf Hitler is probably a very good example of this. He went through horrific trauma through World War I. They naturally think that their society should be built like the military. Not because they want to be powerful as such or anything like that, but because they still think they're living in a terrifying age and they must militarize their society. And the natural partner to that is what? It's tyrannical regimes, it's communism. It's a hierarchical, militarized society. And curiously, these war hero leaders, these generals, who are basically fucked up, they're really good at winning the war, but not so much the peace, because they turn the peace into a war, or they militarize their societies because that's what feels so right to them, because they've been traumatized and they're stuck in that reality. It feels probably completely irresponsible for them not to operate a militarized structure in their society. So if you ever go to war, people, try not to celebrate the war hero too much who's had their brain cooked from frontline battle. They could be the absolute worst people you want in peacetime because they're going to recreate the war zone, the war mode. Because again, that is 100% what compulsively feels right for them to them because they're psychologically stuck in the past.